Are ancient writings of Caesar evidence that Caesar existed? This comes from Walk with Timothy. I would assume so, but do we know that the writings were written by him? Do we know that if they were written by his those around him who wanted to make him look good? Or do we know they were all just made up stories? So you got to take all these things into existence. We know there's coinage, right, with his appearance on it. So that's usually one of the very strong archaeological things about a person existing, first off. So I don't remember of writings of Caesar, but that's just not my knowledge base. Ashley Webb says the Bible is the proof, the validation, and the full revelation of God. That's a big claim. First off, revelation is, I cannot imagine, honestly, a justification for believing in revelation. I really can't. It's, how are you going to prove what comes in somebody else's head? We have that limitation right off the bat. It's the same thing about Muhammad, and I go to him, point him out specifically because he was basically, as the setup goes, one person who received the information, not like 150 people, so it seems more reasonable to think it could come through one and not 150 that then were collated together. Validation, yeah. I can't consider the Bible proof. There's just too much inconsistency to it, and not enough corroboration with other things of the time. There's almost no archaeological evidence for Jesus, for example. So I do consider it evidence. Some people don't, and perhaps they just know more than I do. But I do consider it evidence, but just not sufficient for anything divine. Walk with Timothy again. Can we believe any ancient writings since they're all copies? We have no originals. Yeah, that's a very good point. And every time somebody says to me there are thousands of copies of ancient copies of the Bible, that's problematic. I mean, right? Because we don't have the originals. And if they're the same book or similar to the similar versions of the same book, they had access to something previous to it. So having 1,000 copies doesn't really mean much other than as evidence that there was an earlier book. Again, it does not become evidence for anything supernatural or divine. It just becomes evidence of it being a popular book and a popular belief, if you will. Only people who don't know God have to decide if they believe or not. Well, we don't decide if we believe. We believe or not based on evidence and logic. So if you're going to decide if you want to believe something, then you're misleading yourself. You're taking a position because you want to take it or not. So we don't decide, we conclude, and then yes or no, depending on what our conclusion is. I suppose it's somewhat fair to say that we don't know God if we decide God doesn't exist. It's also quite fair to say that perhaps that is because there is no God there. So that is also open to you, in which case the question to me then becomes, why is it that you believe in something? So science, this is an interesting one. Science is natural philosophy. Not quite. So obviously everybody knows philosophy goes way back, right? Pre BC, 500 BC, 1000 BC, etc. However far it goes back. When you're doing philosophy, the way I see it is basically it's thought, right? It's a very open tool. It's a realm where you can ask any question and you can pursue the thoughts, and does this conclusion lead to that conclusion? Logic is your best tool, it's almost your only tool, actually, but you can only get so far with logic, right? Because very often, because we see how many fallacies there are, it's really easy to make fallacious mistakes and not notice them, especially if you've got a conclusion that is desirable. But philosophy about nature, that's natural philosophy, okay? And that existed before science did. Now, I think it was in the 1600s that the London Royal Society was born, and that's considered the first scientific organization. So if you take natural philosophy, again, philosophy about nature, and then add experimentation, now you have science. So science is a more elaborate methodology than just philosophy. You're using additional tools now. So it grew out from natural philosophy, but it is not a philosophy all by itself because it's philosophy plus. There's evidence of a huge floodplain to include all of Egypt. Evidence is dried up ocean is all. Yeah, I mean, we know that a global flood cannot physically happen, so I'm sure there's going to be evidence of local floods and stories to go along with it. To say that a global flood happened because it is mentioned in a lot of different books, to me just does not work. Floods happen, right? Floods always happen. We don't see, well, until recent years with climate change, we don't see as much flooding because we have flood control technology that's been around for at least 200 years. Back when there was no flood control, things would flood probably pretty frequently, once a year or something, who knows? Or are you just not wanting to accept reality and spiritualism? I very much want to know what's true, so I will accept reality quicker than, I'm going to assume that something exists if I see it, as opposed to think that I'm hallucinating it. I am not a fan of spiritualism. I don't see justification for spiritualism. I don't say it doesn't exist. Same thing as the agnostically atheist on spiritualism too, even though that's not the right word. Aspiritualist? Aspiritual? Not whatever. The wisdom of perceptual knowledge. I assume this is also related to philosophy. That's an interesting way to think of it. Everything that we know as individuals now comes in through our senses, right? So it is going to be, the perception is going to be the original source, even if it's not our perception, right? It could be the perception of somebody who figured something out earlier logically and then taught it, and then we learned it from that teacher, for example. But it's going to come from a perception at some point. Now, in more modern times, some of that perception is going to be as perceived by the tools that we use to measure things. So it's not a subjective perception, but more of an objective perception, even though you still have that step of us reading the output and interpreting the output of the tool.